Colonial America, 1607 to 1763. We can date this period of U.S. history with these dates because 1607 represents the first successful, enduring colony of the English in North America with the founding of Jamestown. And then 1763 works as a good terminus date for this period as it represents the end of the French and Indian War and the Peace of Paris, which secures English control over North America and, of course, will begin to lead to the events that lead to the American Revolution. There were many reasons for the English to get more involved in the construction of colonies in North America. They have just gone through the English Reformation, in which Henry VIII famously declares himself to be the head of the church, creates a new church, the Anglican Church. In many ways, it was Catholicism, but without the Pope. Then you have the Reformation under Elizabeth I, which really secures England as an Anglican country, more or less settles the religion question in England for the time being. And there's enormous feeling of patriotism and pride in their queen, Queen Elizabeth. Great motivation for overseas exploration. And also the very significant defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, which really represent the pinnacle of Spanish power, particularly Spanish naval power. And now the English become one of the most significant seafaring nations in the entire world. Also, the practice of primogeniture. Primogeniture is the legal procedure in which the firstborn heir of a family inherits the entire estate. The estate, particularly of a wealthy landowner, was not divided up equally among the sons, certainly not the women, but even not equally among the sons of a wealthy landowner. It was all given to the firstborn. So with the entire estate being given to the firstborn, that left a lot of second and thirdborn children looking to make their own fortune, having no tie necessarily to land or an estate in England they needed to defend and make sure it prospered, and frees them up to go conduct exploration and colonization in the New World. The English had already had success in colonization with the colonization of Ireland. Ireland being viewed as a poor and backward and particularly Catholic country, the English had set up settlements and secured control of a lot of the land and made the Irish work on the land, often for low wages. And so they had already had some experience in this adventure of colonization. And then also the construction of joint stock companies, which was an early form of commercial capitalism in which investors could pool their resources. And if the expedition was successful, they stood to make a profit. And if it was not successful, their losses were only minimal. So there's a lot of causes and significant motivations for English colonization. The first attempt by the English to create a colony in the New World was off the coast of what we would call North Carolina today, at Roanoke. This was led by Sir Walter Raleigh, who led over 100 settlers to build an island fort there. They set up on one of these Outer Bank islands of North America. And then Raleigh leaves and heads back to England. There are long delays in resupplying the island. The settlers go without food and ammunition and key resources to continue their colony for a long time. Eventually, when Raleigh and others return to Roanoke, the island has been completely deserted. Okay, here is some reconstructed fortifications at the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site. Roanoke has the distinction of the first English child being born at that location, named Virginia Dare. And when the settlers return, the English finally return to Roanoke. The delays have been too long, and the island settlement is missing. It's a very strange, event. It's entirely disappeared. There's no sign of the settlers. There are no graves. There are no bodies. Even the dwellings have been dismantled and removed. If there is a clue that remains, the only clue that is there is the word croton, which is written on one of the trees. There's been a lot of speculation about what that word means. If it was the name of a local Indian tribe, which is a good possibility, and the speculation is everything from this local tribe came and attacked the settlers at Roanoke and destroyed their dwelling and killed all the settlers and hid the bodies, to that the settlers became so desperate that they actually went to the local tribe and joined the tribe and eventually intermarried, and are essentially lost to history. So a lot of speculation exactly what happens to the so-called lost colony of Roanoke, but certainly it is not an enduring colony. We need to look further north for the example of the first successful English colonies in the New World. The Virginia Company of London is one of the significant joint stock companies that were formed in England, in which stock owners pooled their resources, came together, and then hoped to make a profit in the New World. This company was chartered by King James himself in 1606 to create colonies in the New World. The company essentially divides the Atlantic coast of North America between one company called the Plymouth Company and another company called the Virginia Company. And it is the Virginia Company that successfully settles Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. They had already had a failed colony in Bermuda shortly after that in 1609. So Jamestown, the first successful and enduring colony of the English in the New World. Remember that the Spanish had constructed St. Augustine a number of decades before, which is the oldest enduring city in North America today. Jamestown is the first enduring English settlement or colony in the New World at 1607. Jamestown was constructed at a very strategic location. It is on the James River, which connects the Atlantic Ocean with Chesapeake Bay, and then intrudes into what we would call the state of Virginia today on this small peninsula that juts out of the James River. The settlers believed this would be an ideal location to settle because they would have the river surrounding them as a natural fortification, and then this small inlet dividing the main peninsula from the mainland. And so they set up settlement here and construct numerous dwellings and also a fence and some primitive fortifications. Also have a dock for ships to land. They also construct a small Anglican church. This is a reconstructed version of that church, and begin to grow products in the local area and conduct relationship with the Indians. The greatest challenge for the Jamestown settlers is the lack of food. Immediately when the Jamestown settlers arrive, they begin looking for precious metals like gold and silver. They spend their time digging instead of planting. As a result, when winter comes along, and it's a very severe winter in the early years at Jamestown, they are woefully short on food and supplies, and this leads to what we can identify as a starving time. There are inadequate provisions. The colonists have to resort to eating everything from snakes and eels to boiling their own shoe leather. There are some stories of victims of the famine being eaten by other colonists. 60 of the original 214 settlers survive. It is a very high mortality rate in Jamestown. It's a death trap to actually go to Jamestown. Just recently, archaeologists had discovered a mass grave of some of the victims of this starving time. The colonists are so desperate and consider withdrawing from the colony that they actually load up their ship and they start heading down the James River, and at just the right time, a supply ship comes from England, resupplies the colony, and convinces the settlers to remain. Thereafter, the colony at Jamestown is more or less under the command of a soldier named John Smith. John Smith spends a lot of his time exploring the area and also writing a diary that will be published back in England about his discoveries and his descriptions of the new land and life at Jamestown. But the significant thing about John Smith is that he imposes a rule that all those who don't work will not eat. There were some wealthy gentlemen who had come from England and settled at Jamestown and thought that agricultural work, working in the fields, was above them. And they weren't going to participate that. That was for lower laborers and field hands. John Smith changes that and says anyone who does not work will not eat. Thereafter, Jamestown starts to get a measure of stability and continue on. Originally, settlers at Jamestown have a good relationship with the local Indians and their chief named Powhatan. Powhatan led a very large confederacy of the local tribes there, and his very famous daughter is, of course, Pocahontas. Now, there's this strange episode in which, on one occasion, John Smith seems to be kidnapped by Powhatan's tribe and is brought to their meeting area, and John Smith is put down and have his head laid on a rock, and Powhatan's warriors go through this ritual, and it appears that they're going to smash his head on the rock until Pocahontas runs over and stops the hand of the warriors, therefore seeming to save John Smith's life. Now, John Smith interprets this event as Pocahontas was deeply in love with him and wanted to deliver him from certain death from the Indian tribe. In reality, to our best guess, that this was actually a type of adoption ritual that this Indian tribe conducted, in which when a stranger entered into the camp, they would go through this ritual of attempting, making it to appear like they are about to kill him, but then staying their hand. In other words, they never intended to actually kill John Smith, but they just go through this ritual. So John Smith probably interprets this event wrong. In any case, to finish the story of Pocahontas eventually does marry one of the English settlers named John Rolfe. And John Rolfe is deeply in love with Pocahontas, brings her back to England. They attend the opera, and Pocahontas is kind of the talk of all of official London. She is dressed in English clothes, but it does not take long for Pocahontas to be exposed to European diseases, possibly smallpox, and she dies in England. John Rolfe, distraught by this event, returns to the New World. Originally, he travels through Bermuda, which at this point is a Spanish colony. He travels through Bermuda and he notices the very large leaf tobacco that is being grown in Bermuda. It was illegal to smuggle Spanish tobacco seeds, which were very profitable and created this very large leaf tobacco. It was illegal to smuggle these seeds out of a Spanish colony. But somehow, John Rolfe manages to smuggle the Spanish tobacco seeds in his pocket and brings them to Jamestown. This sweeter and large leaf tobacco will make Jamestown a successful colony. It becomes Jamestown's first cash crop. By cash crop means that the colony is actually finally profitable. This is certainly not the product that the English were looking for out of their new colony, but nevertheless they accept it as worthwhile, and it justifies the colony's existence. As simultaneously as the introduction of tobacco and its growth as a cash crop, in 1619 we have the arrival, probably the first arrival, of Africans to the colony of Jamestown to work as slaves in the emerging tobacco fields around Jamestown. So if we want to find a good possible date for the beginning of slavery in North America, 1619 may be a good date. Now, eventually relationships between Powhatan's Confederacy and the English degenerate into a very conflicted relationship, and so 1622 there's a large-scale attack by the local Confederacy that kills 347 English settlers. The English are resupplied, refortified with ammunition and weapons and so forth, and eventually are successful in driving back Powhatan's Confederacy and securing control of Jamestown in the larger Virginia area. Jamestown was devastated by the Indian Massacre, but nevertheless, with reinforcements and additional settlers and troops and greater firepower, they are able to secure so much of what will become the colony of Virginia. The Virginia Company is also involved in the settlement of the second successful and enduring colony in North America for the English, and that is, of course, Plymouth. So, once again, it's the same company, but this is a different division here. And they had launched something of a small colony, the Popham Colony, 1607 in Maine, but it was very small and didn't really endure. So what occurs at Plymouth is indeed connected to the London Company and the Virginia Company, but it's a different location, and the settlers that arrive and the purpose of the colony, of course, is very different. So Jamestown is the first colony. It's in 1607, and then Plymouth, Massachusetts, is the second enduring colony for the English, established in 1620. Those that settle the English colony at Plymouth are known as the Separatists. They're known as the Separatists because, unlike Anglicans who were loyal to the King's Church, the Anglican Church, and unlike the Puritans who wanted to purify the church of remaining Catholic elements in the church, the Separatists wanted to separate from the church. The Separatists, we can trace their origins probably to a pastor named Robert Brown, who founded the Separatists, believing that the Anglican Church was beyond purification. That even though technically it was a Protestant church because there was no Pope and it had a lot of elements of Protestantism to it, he disagreed with the Puritans that it could be purified of its remaining Catholic elements, and the important thing for devout Christians, devout Protestants who were Calvinists, was to separate from the church. So originally a congregation was formed in Nottinghamshire and then moved to Scrooby, England. They met in a wealthy manor house owned by William Bradford. And then because of facing increased ostracization and discrimination, the Separatists, or sometimes called the Brownists, moved to the Netherlands, to the city of Leiden in 1607. While they're in Leiden, John Robinson is their pastor, and many of the church members struggle now in the Dutch Republic to find employment. A lot of the Dutch guilds prevent these English foreigners from actually participating and getting jobs. A lot of the Separatists are horrified by some of the very loose morals among the Dutch, and they are watching their children gradually adopt the Dutch language and inspired by their customs. And so therefore, they decide on embarking on another emigration. So they hear of the Virginia Company, this group that was financed by a bunch of investors, this joint stock company called the Merchant Adventurers. And the Merchant Adventurers are determined to launch two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, to depart in 1620. And of course, the Separatists will be a large group that number those that will make this journey in 1620. Originally, the Speedwell is to accompany the Mayflower, but because of numerous damage to the ship and is taking on water before they can get very far, the Speedwell turns back. And so it is therefore just the Mayflower, carrying 102 passengers with about 25 to 30 crew members, departs from England in 1620. The ship is heavily armed. It's going to be a 2-month voyage. Roughly about halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, in the midst of a storm, the main mast cracks, which jeopardizes the success of the trip. Originally, they are headed to the Virginia area, or slightly north of it, perhaps around the Hudson River. But strong winds blow their course north, and so they end up north of Virginia, north of the Hudson River and what will become New York, to Cape Cod. So this is Cape Cod here, with Cape Cod Bay, of course, named for the abundance of cod, that type of fish, in the area. This crowded crew spends the first winter, very cold winter, aboard the ship. They arrive too late to really settle or to grow anything, so they spend this miserable several months aboard the ship. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and scurvy is going to kill half of the occupants. Eventually, they are able to get off the ship in March of 1621 and build some small huts, originally at Provincetown, but eventually move inland with the protection of the Cape against high tides and settle in a settlement that they call Plymouth after one of their hometowns. When they arrive there, before actually getting off the ship, they sign the Mayflower Compact. We can think of the Mayflower Compact perhaps as one of the first political documents in United States history. It is an agreement, maybe a covenant. Some would say even a constitution, the first constitution in American history. And the words are, "In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, in the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November in the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, Anno Domini 1620. Mayflower Compact serves as an organizing document for this community. A couple of key important figures for the settlement of the Plymouth colony. One is Miles Standish, whereas Jamestown had John Smith as a soldier to kind of organize, particularly fortify the colony at Jamestown. Plymouth has Miles Standish, who is also an English soldier and provides some fortifications and directions on how to defend this colony settled here at Plymouth. You also have William Brewster, who's a pastor and an elder. He'll be an important advisor to Governor Bradford. And then, of course, William Bradford himself. He'll be governor of the Plymouth colony for almost 30 years, from 1621 to 1657. It was his manor house that the separatists originally meet in England in the first place. His most important contribution is that he writes of Plymouth Plantation. This is a diary, a journal, an account, a narrative of the settlement of Plymouth. For a long time, this document was lost until it was discovered in a dwelling in 19th century England. And so our knowledge of the Plymouth Plantation increases significantly in the last 100 years with the discovery of this publication. So the Pilgrims, of course, land. They're also called Pilgrims, the Separatists or Brownists. They're also called Pilgrims because they are travelers. Legend has it that they land at Plymouth Rock, but of course this is something that is created much later to commemorate the spot of their landing. And they established Plymouth Plantation. These huts with some fencing, surrounded by some fields, and they begin to fish and also plant some things in the area. One of the things that the Pilgrims have to their advantage, and they notice right away, is the absence of a lot of Indian tribes in the local area. What the Pilgrims initially did not realize is that the surrounding Patuxet tribe was wiped out in the immediate years before their arrival by a large, probably smallpox plague, destroying their numbers. As a result, this area, in large part, is almost unoccupied. There are natives in the area, including Samoset, who's one of the first Indians to walk into Pilgrim Plantation, much to the fear of the Pilgrims, greet them, and then introduce them to his chief, who is Massasoit. Massasoit is the chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy, a confederacy of tribes in the surrounding area, and they both smoke a peace pipe and sign a mutual defense treaty to live in peace with each other, a peace treaty that holds as long as Massasoit is alive. One of the most significant Indians that the Pilgrims encounter in their settlement at Plymouth, of course, is Squanto. Squanto was a Patuxet Indian. He had actually been captured and enslaved by other Englishmen. He had been brought to London and had lived there for over 7 years. He, of course, learns English and some of the ways of the white man, and then he successfully returns to his area. Of course, most of his tribe has been wiped out, but he has developed respect and perhaps affection for Englishmen, and so he is instrumental in helping the Pilgrims plant and demonstrates that they could fertilize their fields by using fish heads in their crops, and also how to capture eels, and provided them with another food source, and becomes a friend of the Pilgrims in the area. So gradually the Plymouth Plantation, this colony, expands, and so as a result in 1621, the Pilgrims with the surrounding tribe of Massasoit and his tribesmen come together and hold a feast of Thanksgiving to thank God for a safe voyage and then the settlement of their colony, in which they eat probably not turkey but pheasant and some other local crops, perhaps cranberries, and also fire their muskets and have a celebration of thanks for God for delivering them through all their trials. Relationship between the Plymouth colony and the surrounding Indian tribes declines, though, after Massasoit's death. And so tribes, particularly coming up from Rhode Island, what will become Rhode Island, the Pequots, lead to a lot of conflict between the Pilgrims that are growing in numbers, Plymouth settlers, and the local Pequots. So as a result, in 1636 to 1638, we have the Pequot War, which is a very, very devastating war to a lot of the local tribes and so forth. Gradually, the English move in from Plymouth and create other settlements such as Duxbury, Bridgewater, Taunton, Middleborough, Rochester, Rehoboth, Sandwich, Barnstable, and so forth, and settle all along the Cape. A lot of these are fishing colonies, and gradually they're growing some crops in the interior.